noon, our time here in Washington, D.C., and we thank you for your patience. We're working across time zones, cultures, and the Latina in me is saying, okay, should we go ahead and start or wait a couple of minutes? But I know we have students in the audience, so I want to thank you. I know you're maybe taking midterms or exams or papers, so thank you for being here. It's truly an honor to host this event today. My name is Juliana Ospina Cano, and I am part of the Future Leaders Connect program fellowship. And I was selected among 11,000 young leaders to represent the United States. I'm one out of 4 that had a brilliant and transformative experience in London as a result of our commitment to making the world a more equitable place for the next generation ahead of us. Welcome for those of you that came to the George Washington University, and for those of you that are tuning online on YouTube. We will try our best to make sure that we keep up with the half-second delay that I understand that is with us. And we're going to have a Q&A question at the end of our conversation. So if you have pressing questions, make sure you jot them down so you don't forget about them. We also want to thank the Elliott School of International Affairs, the Hemisphere of American Studies department here at GW, and No Last Generation for hosting us, and obviously the British Council for having this wonderful space to have a candid conversation around migration between the United States and Mexico. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sir Ciarán Devane. He is the Chief Executive Officer for the British Council, where he has been mobilizing the organization's mission to make sure that we all understand what soft power looks like in the 21st century and the role that culture plays in that role. I'm sure you're happy to be back at George Washington. I know you graduated from here. You got your master's degree. So if you could please help me and welcome Sir Ciarán Devane to our conversation today.
Nice to be back. Great. Well, a little bit for me maybe on why this topic is important. When I go back in the history of our organization, we were set up in the 1930s. Which you'll all remember from history was a very difficult time in Europe and elsewhere in the world. And the people who set the organization up said that our role should be to use the cultural resources of the UK to foster the interchange of knowledge, ideas and discoveries. And the reason to do that was to create a basis of friendly knowledge and understanding between people. So the theory was that people who know each other and understand each other and connect with each other are less likely to be fearful of each other, and good things are more likely to happen than bad. And if they can write that in the run-up to the Second World War, as fascism was taking a grip across Europe, and then I think that kind of principle holds today. And that's why we're interested in this topic of migration, but really the cross-boundary intercultural conversations that need to happen so that migration, which will always be with us, is handled well. And if I can just give you a little bit on 2 examples on topics that we're wrestling with. The first one is the forced migration because of the Syria crisis. When I visit Lebanon and visit the education ministry and go to schools, you're meeting an education system where half of the children have arrived from Syria. So schools are double shifting, and the communities are feeling under huge pressure. They're being incredibly generous. So part of our view as the British Council, and indeed it's very much a UK government view as well, is that if you have to support people as they migrate. It's not enough to give them a tent, give them a bag of rice and a bottle of water. You have to worry about education, you have to worry about economic participation, if you want things which are already horrendous not to get worse. And the second example really is how we're handling things in the UK as well, where a piece of research by British Future is saying that what people are worrying about in the migration issue isn't so much the immigrant. You know, I'm an immigrant in the UK. It's pressure on public services. So if you have 40 kids in the class and you used to have 30, or you 30 when you used to have 20, and it's this feeling of people taking from the system who haven't participated or contributed to the system as well, and it's causing tension, but particularly in places where the rate of change of migration is high. So the great cities like London, with very high populations of migration, do not have a migration problem because they know how to adapt. But other towns don't. So I think we're all wrestling with this, and I know that the US-Mexico issue is a version of that. But that's why we wanted to convene this conversation, and indeed convene the conversation in London, to say how do we have this conversation so we understand the topic, we explore the topic, and the next generation of future leaders take the issue forward.
That's a great point, and I love what you said about making it a humane issue and bringing the human side, because we are really privileged to have a cadre of experts within the Mexican, the United States delegation. And so I would like now to introduce them, and they're going to share not only their policy vision, but also their area of expertise, and how are they going to use that to help us galvanize and move towards a more progressive and equitable agenda. So I will start with Imani Jacqueline Brown. She is also representing the United States, but she's now in Poland. Imani, hello.
Hi, everyone. Yes. So my name is Imani Jacqueline Brown. I'm a New Orleans-based artist, activist, and researcher. Professionally, I'm the founder of Lights Out, an organization that uses creative strategies to demystify the process of neighborhood development post-disaster. And I'm the director of programs at Antenna, an arts organization. And my policy vision is that we as a society will start to re-examine our values, our priorities, and create policies that uphold those values as we look forward to a world that is going to be dramatically different from the one we live in today due to a myriad crises, not least of which is ecological upheaval. And we'll need to ensure that our cities adapt and evolve so that they can become equitable sanctuaries for all people, regardless of race, economic status, and nation of origin.
Can you press the if you can hear me now? What about now? Yes? Okay. I'm gonna go ahead. I'm not receiving any feedback. I hope, can anyone give me a sign that you can hear me? Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Karina Izquierdo. I am Mexican. I am based in Mexico City at the moment. I am an architect and I am working on the sustainable urban development of cities and also on territorial planning with a climate change perspective. At the moment, I am working on a citizen participation project for the post-disaster and recovery from the earthquake in Mexico. And parallel to that, I am developing a project with a UN initiative called Sustainable Development Solutions Network, focused on informal settlements on the metropolitan area of Mexico City, focused on reducing inequalities and building resilient livelihoods. So that is the space that I work on, and the intersection of how our urban footprints impact on the environment and as a consequence on the quality of life of its dwellers.
Sonia, your mic is muted. Can you please unmute?
Yeah, sorry, you have been muted for the longest. So we were trying to go off from our guest inputs next.
You are next.
Awesome. So hi everyone, my name is Daca. I am a poet, culture organizer, and activist from Harlem by way of Ecuador. I am also a co-founder and help build some of the largest organizations in the country, coordinating and participating in groundbreaking civil disobediences, actions in the immigrant rights movement in the United States. I also founded some of the first creative artistic projects by and for undocumented writers, artists. I am currently the managing director of Culture Strike, a national arts and culture organization working on issues of climate change and immigration. And my policy vision for me is centered on shifting migrant narratives. So shifting global migrant narratives that allow us to change public sentiment so that people really understand what migrant communities, undocumented refugee communities are going through in this process, most of them who have been forced to migrate. And so working on that in order for us to also have a really rich conversation and dialogue on the type of policies and bills and legislation that should be passing in order to address the needs of these communities that are marginalized.
Great, thank you, Sonia. And last but not least, we have Miguel Mendeveliz Ruiz. He is representing the Mexico delegation, literally at the United Nations in New York. So Miguel, your turn now.
Morning, everyone. So, as Julian said, I'm Mexico to the United Nations. I'm an advisor in disarmament, and also I'm part of the co-facilitation team leading to the on my. So basically, my policy vision in this Future Leaders program is how can we make migration a more safe, orderly, and regular, but now between the U.S. and Mexico.
Being very humble, I know he also was part of the team and collaborating and the team that just won the Nobel Peace Prize on nuclear proliferation. So we have a great team, and it's really an honor to share our visions collectively as we think about the United States and Mexico. And part of the reason why I'm here is because I work at Unidos US, formerly known as the National Council of La Raza, is the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States that advances Latino rights, and we've been doing this for almost 50 years. And through my work and my personal story, I've been able to not only change the way we see migration from the education perspective, but also how we influence policy here in Washington, D.C., and through our network of 273 community-based organizations throughout the country. So we all get to see not only the impact migration has, but more importantly, what it feels like in 2017 contemporary America as we look ahead under this administration, but also how Mexico has been dealing and changing the way they see migration in their respective contexts. So with that, I would like to start the conversation and thinking and reflecting on our own experiences and really elevate what we are doing as Future Leaders Connect to address the opportunities and also the challenges that are related to migration, in particular as we consider the current political climate. So Sonia, I would like to start with you. If you can just please highlight the opportunities and the challenges and how you are being and disrupting the system in your own way.
Thank you, Juliana, for just amazing facilitation and asking these incredible questions that all of us are excited to answer. So for me, as we're thinking about immigration and what we should be considering for both sides, the U.S. and the Mexican country, like we have to start thinking about the political changing times that we're in. We also have to consider the different climate changes that globally we are experiencing, and also the different dilemmas that are coming up via if it's like racial issues, LGBT issues. So thinking about all of these different things is approaching a very humane way to this conversation. I think that sometimes when we get into this kind of dialogues, we tend to forget that we're actually talking about human beings, undocumented folks, children, mothers, fathers, grandparents. And so one thing that I always ask folks when we're considering immigration reform is that we think about what are the consequences of our policies, what are the consequences of our legislations and the impacts of actual human beings, and how do we approach it in a very humane way and uplifting community.
No, and it goes well with what you were saying earlier, Sir Ciarán, about highlighting the human face, but also the services that people need when they migrate for one reason or another. So could you please highlight how the British Council is addressing the opportunities and the challenges, and maybe elaborate on some of those, please?
Well, if I can give you maybe examples driven from the forced migration out of Syria. One is bright young people who were just about to go to university, who've been displaced and have arrived in Lebanon and have had their education and their career plans taken away from them. So one of the things that we're doing is working with the local education system to increase their quality of English. So, but that the intervention isn't just, let me teach you your English, it's also a psychosocial intervention. So the curriculum is designed really to be a conversation about the trauma of having to flee the house, the trauma of having family members killed, and the trauma of finding yourself in a new society, which, while it is being incredibly generous, it's also incredibly challenging. So what we've been able to do is design curricula which, while ostensibly they are about the teaching of English, they're also about emotional resilience of young people who've been traumatized, with the intention that they can then participate in further education and higher education in countries in Europe and in and around the neighborhood. The second example is some of the refugees who've arrived in Greece. So they've traveled in boats across the Mediterranean. We're working jointly with UNICEF to make sure that the quality of education for the younger children is up to what we would regard as an acceptable standard. Because often in a humanitarian crisis, the goal is the bag of rice, the tent and the bottle of water, and possibly some basic primary education, but maybe 50 children in the class, no control over the quality of teaching. And what we've been doing is working with UNICEF and insisting that the quality of the provision of education in the camp is the same quality as in the primary school down the road, rather than you should be grateful, we're giving you something, even though there's no quality control on that. And it's really around saying, how can we invest in those young people so that we don't lose that generation? And the goal that the ministry that we're working with in Lebanon has is that no child should have their education disrupted. Now, it's an ambition. It's a very difficult thing to leave. So that idea of working with the existing system to help them maintain standards and to be resilient in the face of huge numbers of forced migrants is one of the things which we're trying to do and hopefully doing successfully.
Yeah, and it actually ties to my policy vision. So I work in the education shop at Unidos US, and I have the privilege of investing resources in communities right now in 11 different states to actually address specifically that, right? How can we better provide an education without compromising socio-emotional development, while also tackling and adding rigor, because just the fact that because the students are in our classroom, they still deserve a comprehensive education that will allow them to thrive either here or wherever they go after they graduate from high school. So we do that, and we add the cultural competency piece, right? Through our research and my research, we have learned that the way that Mexican immigrants and migrants see and value education is different from the way that we do it here in the United States. There is a respect and there is that trust in the education system. And here in the United States, there is the assumption that you should be very vocal with your classroom teacher, right? You should be at every PTA demanding an education. And we have noticed with some of our parents is that they really trust the system, right? And when they start questioning and demanding for higher standards or services, it's something that really clashes with their perception of the American education system. So the way we do it at Unidos US and through my work is making sure we facilitate conversations so we can unpack what it means to be educated in the United States or in Mexico or coming from Mexico, to make sure that we all understand how to move our education forward. Because as we all know, most of our students from Hispanic descent are from Mexico, right? And the challenges and the opportunities are different. And we spoke about this, and Miguel, you and I were part of this conversation about labels. What labels do we give to folks that come from Mexico to the United States? Do we qualify them as immigrant, migrant, refugee? It depends, right? And depends on the category, and depends on their status, and it depends on who is processing that form, right? So we also have to take a step back when we're looking at our students that are coming from Mexico and our families to make sure that we use the right terminology without dehumanizing their stories. And with that, Miguel, I would like to kick it over to you. We've been talking a lot about immigration reform here in the United States. We have a deadline here in the US, December the 8th. Funding for the US government might come, to a halt if we don't move with our representatives soon. And there are questions about really changing and perhaps galvanizing in terms of either passing a Clean Dream Act or maybe doing something with our youth that are Daca dependent. Miguel, from where you sit with the Mexican government and your experience, what do you think are some considerations that we should think of when we're talking about immigration reform?
Well, my area of expertise and the experience I've been gathering here in the UN, opportunity in the ongoing process of migration, which aims to be the international instrument where not only in Mexico or in the US, but worldwide. So I see this opportunity for both the US and Mexican government to guide agreement and into bilateral infrastructure in terms of institution in this whole migration reform. So what I would say is that once this a very, very important opportunity for dialogue, those best practices, other parts of the world, bilateral.
I'm sorry. Miguel, we're having a really hard time hearing and understanding. I think we have connection problems. But if I may interpret and translate what you were saying, just sharing that this is a great opportunity for dialogue, not only for the United States, but also in Mexico. And it seems like the United Nations is starting that dialogue, right? Where the way I've seen it at the ground here in the United States, especially with the embassy here in Washington, D.C., is the way they've shifted their consular services to make sure that they address the human side of the migrant and the immigrant here by really sharing resources that are not only culturally competent, but our families and our Mexican friends can understand and comprehend, particularly as with this new administration where things are moving really, really fast. At Unidos US, we have learned from the consulate that they really want to make sure that their citizens are educated in terms of what their rights mean here in the United States. And we also know that the Mexican government in Mexico has changed policies to make sure, for instance, that children that are deported back to their communities can enroll in school, even if they don't have their transcript or proof of education, because the goal is to make sure that they are in school to meet their needs. And I know, Sonia, you are also really involved at the community level, especially right now with your organization. Can you please talk about some of the specific pieces and things that you're doing at the community level to talk about immigration reform, and what does it mean in 2017?
So for me, I started actually working on the community level about 10 years ago when I was trying to figure out my own immigration status as an undocumented person. So I grew up being undocumented and was able to adjust my immigration status in the past 2 years, but that's by luck. That is not the actual experience of many undocumented folks in this country right now. And so what I always say is that the power that is there to change political, to bring political change and social change is actually from local groundwork community folks. Those are the folks who are leading the initiatives, who are drafting legislation, who are in the embodied experience of being undocumented or refugees, or trying to find, ameliorations to this really anti-immigrant climate that we're in this country that are impacting their family members and their communities. And so one of the things that, Juliana, you just brought up, what's happening with the Clean Dream Act and Defer for Childhood Arrivals. So these undocumented young people are currently right now, advocating and just pushing really hard in the United States to pass some type of legislation, to pass some type of pathway for their immigration status to be adjusted, or for them to even feel safe and not feel deported. Right now, we're also in the United States, we're being temporary protective status, TPS, is being challenged. So that means countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Sierra Leone, folks in Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Haiti, Honduras, Nepal, Yemen, these are communities who were, escaping war, escaping different climate disasters. And now under this administration, that might not be there anymore. And so right now is the moment to listen to local communities, take what initiatives they're pushing for, and really listen to their stories, because they're the ones who are experiencing this. And so I'm hoping that that's what we can do in this space, as as many of us who are working on policy, to listen to those embodied experiences, because they know better.
Absolutely. And I know, Karina, you also do some ground level work, and you look at it from an environmental perspective and how people move for different reasons. Can you also speak on what you have seen with your experience from that particular lens?
Yes, for sure. First of all, to recognize that cities hold economic and innovation concentrations that could ensure migrants can maximize their contributions to the economic and social fabric of communities. And so it's very important for me to get through the importance that climate change needs to be part of the migration agenda, with a region-specific policy addressing the particular dynamic of the Americas. Because when we're talking about the US-Mexican border, we need to understand that it's broader than that, and that Canada has a role as well, and that Central America has a role as well. And to place that into the dynamics that are happening in terms of climate change, and why Central Americans are being displaced and having to go through Mexico as a transition country. So to recognize and protect climate migrants, and to actually understand that they have a different dynamic from the rest of the migrants. So we don't really know in terms of our region and exact numbers. So we need, first of all, to address this properly from gathering specific data and recognizing where they come from, what's happening, what are the climatic situations that got them to be displaced from their communities. Either it was from the loss of their livelihoods or something else that has provoked this situation. And this is happens when we start to look at the specific numbers and the specific situations and characteristics of climate change in our specific region.
Yeah, and it's a great point, because I've the privilege of working with Imani and learning as well from, you know, Karina and Imani, that bring this very different perspective to migration in terms of climate change, but how cities are developed and how issues of gentrification even and mobilization impact communities, especially immigrant communities here in the United States and in Mexico. And I've done some work in New Orleans with Unidos US, and I've seen it firsthand. So Imani, can you please help us understand what the connection is, and how can we be part of that change to be better educated and more eloquent to diversify our conversation around migration cities?
Thank you, Juliana. Yeah, I mean, to add another stat to what everyone's been saying about the refugee crisis and its relation to cities, a recent City Lab article articulated that 60% of refugees are moving to cities rather than to camps. So we know that cities are also facing massive population growth internationally. There's a shift of the human population to cities, and that's creating a lot of pressure. Not just people moving from other countries, you know, to global cities, but also these massive population shifts intra-nationally. And there are a lot of reasons for this. I mean, there is the opportunity, the excitement, the idea of participating in this international era that we've entered, that cities offer. There's a lot of excitement. There are a lot of pressures that are driving people towards cities as they seek economic opportunity, as they flee from conflict, as they flee from climate disaster. And so it's a system that's currently incredibly out of balance, but it provides incredible opportunities as we start to see people from across cultural differences with different backgrounds, experiences, different forms of expertise, different ideas, best practices converging together. In our cities, we can start to imagine together what our future cities will be like. And they need to be places that are as focused on the right to return for Native residents who might have been displaced. They need to be focused on sanctuary for people who are moving in. But these cities need to be sort of the heart of our social values. They need to espouse those values. But more than that, we can't just say that we value the idea of a sanctuary city. We have to be it. We have to encode those values into policy. We can't just say that we believe in affordable housing and economic opportunity for all. We need to encode it in our housing policy. And in order to create new policy, we have to reflect on old policy, and we have to reflect on history, and we have to realize that all of this global flux, there are a lot of positive reasons for it, but there are a lot of negative reasons. There is a legacy of colonialism and extraction and imperialism that is forcing people to move all over the world against their will. And we need to address that. We need to address policies like vacuum domicilium and see how they drive gentrification today. So in order to look forward, we need to look backwards together.
Yeah, thank you, Manny. And I think the challenging part for all of us and the British Council is you have 8 innovators that are really looking at migration from different areas of expertise and different angles, but really with a commitment to driving that change, right, in the next couple of months, and really highlighting the complexities around migration. Do you want to add
well, I think one of the things we need to watch with urbanization, for me, there are 2 dimensions. One is we have to get the management of cities right, and the ability of cities to respond to waves of immigration, to include people in the economy. That's one half of it. But the other half is the relationship of the city to its region or its hinterland, or where people have come from, because in many, many countries around the world, there is a divide between the perceived values and behaviors and success of people who live in some of the major cities and those who don't. And we saw that in our own referendum on Brexit, if I'm allowed to mention the word, which the cities voted one way and the towns and the villages voted another way. So in this migration and with this increased urbanization of society, we have to make sure that we are not allowing inequality to expand, because that's where a lot of the tension and instability comes from, which then drives further waves of forced migration.
Absolutely, that's a great point. And we have Tara Vargas, and we're running out of time. We have to take questions. We'd love to take questions from the audience and also from our live stream in our community. But Tara, I would love for you to speak and introduce yourself. And I'm just fascinated by your vision and around food sovereignty and what you're doing with your community, and really shattering all the glass ceilings when it comes to what we know about your community. But if you could just please introduce yourself. I'm just really happy that you were able to join.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I was having issues with my laptop, but my name is Tara, and I am half Native American and half Mexican. I am a conservation biologist major, so I do a lot of research in science and climate change and how that affects ecology and food sovereignty. And I was born and raised in South Dakota. My dad, just to give you a little bit of background, my dad was an illegal immigrant, and my mother is a full-blood Native American. So this issue on migration and immigration, I'm kind of conflicted as being a Native American and as being a Mexican, and so so if you have any specific questions, I'd love to answer them.
Yes, and I will also ask the audience either here with us or live, if you have questions, this is the time to send them our way. And I know we have one question, and if you have a specific question for Tara, we can talk about that as well. Yes. Yes, we have one question. Hand up. Tara, if you don't mind expanding on your comment about and the conflicting pieces, because it's important to highlight our voices. Can you expand on what you were saying earlier about the conflict between your Native American heritage and also with your father's background, and why is that a conflicting piece for you?
It's conflicting because Native Americans, and I'm not speaking for all tribes or all people, but I hear a lot of comments with Native Americans that it's really hard to discuss migration and immigration when we were the First Nations people, and having a history of our land being stolen and then moved into areas that are undesirable places to live. And then asking the question, now how do you feel about migration? Like we've taken the best parts of your territory and put you somewhere that we don't even want to live. Now tell us what you feel about having immigrants come in. So that's a really touchy subject in regards to tribal nations. But also on the other hand, I'm half Mexican, and it's really hard to hear comments from people that I have really close, that are near and dear to my heart, hear negative comments about, we don't want Mexicans in here, we don't want immigrants in here. And it's almost like they forget or don't realize or just choose not to be aware of that I'm half Mexican. And hearing comments that they're drug dealers and they're rapists and all these really negative things when half of my heritage comes from Mexico. So that's where it's really conflicting for me and my family when you have one side, and I understand why they aren't really open to conversations with migration, but also on the other side saying like, well, my family wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my my dad's side of the family migrating up.
No, and thank you for sharing. And I truly believe that the opportunity that the British Council has given us, the 50 of us, to have a space to really have these conversations in a really safe space where we can share not only what agendas are, but also the difficult pieces that conflict, right, with our vision and also the communities that we're representing. Is that something that you would like for you to move forward with the British Council and the new application pool that is coming for the Future Leaders Connect in 2018?
Well, the reason we're having this conversation was that when 11,000 people applied for this program, one of the things we did through the process was to ask each of them what they thought the major global issues were which had to be debated, and migration came up as one of the top three. So this is what young people around the world are saying is important to them. It's how does migration happen? How does it happen well? What would be the impact for them? Whether they're an economic migrant, where they're recruited because of a labor shortage, or they're forced to migrate. So the complexity of this issue is one which we will be living with as a society for the next 20, 30 years. So the people who will solve it are the young people, the next generation of leaders. It won't be me and my generation who do it. So what we want to do is to have this conversation in, whether it's between the US and Mexico, if we can support that conversation, but equally the relationship between Lebanon and Syria and other places around the world, because this is going to be a global phenomenon. Some of it will be driven by demographics. The population of Nigeria, currently 170 million, will rise to 340 million. You can argue about the date, but those young people, if they have opportunities in Nigeria, great. If they don't, and particularly in areas we were touching on climate change, where the established way of providing a livelihood collapses, then we really will have migration on the scale that we won't know how to cope with. So this is one of those major issues. And what we want to achieve is that it's the next generation of young leaders who embrace that now. So as we've heard, the complexity of the problem is immense, and the solution will not be simple.
Yeah, thank you. We have one question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Renee Renaud. I'm a master's student in the Latin American and Hemispheric Studies program here. My question is for Karina. I understand that you've worked on urban and rural integration in Colombia specifically. I was wondering if you could share some of the lessons of how to promote urban and rural integration, and if any of those lessons might apply also to Mexico.
Hi, yes, thank you for the question. Absolutely. Well, Latin America has a lot of things in common, but specifically these two countries, Colombia and Mexico, have even more given the situation with the drug cartels, right? So one of the things that happened in Colombia as a solution to the urban and rural stark division was to create a city system, and the city system was focused on basically reducing that huge gap and the geography of prosperity. So what does our territory looks like right now? And they were what we looked at was how violence created the very fragmented territory. So how to start to making connections between all of these territories through what we were calling the geography of prosperity. So very specific small-sized to medium-sized cities were chosen to create this to erase that dichotomy between the urban and the rural, basically. So this can be totally translated to Mexico and start to look into those places that at a certain given time, farmers and all of the agricultural economic activities will be, for example, affected by climate change. And what are the opportunities that in terms of cities, small-sized or not, that we are giving to those people. If we are to approach it in a mitigation strategy perspective, then not only focusing on investing in sustainable agriculture as well, but parallel to that, investing in sustainable livelihoods with small-sized cities to integrate the rural and the urban.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. And if you don't mind introducing yourself really quickly.
Yeah, of course. My name is Johnny Williams. I'm also a master's student here within the Latin American Hemispherics program, excuse me. I have a two-part question, and they may not necessarily blend together, but it's for the overall panel. If I may, how do you let me preface, I have a government background, so it's coming from that particular perspective or that lens. How do you differentiate Daca from the larger immigration conversation? Because for most of us, we may know, but for those individuals within the public at large, may not understand that the DREAM Act is a policy versus Daca being an executive order coming from the president. And here, when we talk about immigration in the United States, it's only from the larger lens and not looking at the individuals specifically. And we know there's a wide variety of individuals. The second part comes from the intersectionality of immigration, which as someone who has familial ties to immigrants, but also as someone who is only perceived as a Black man, I know for a fact that your struggle is my struggle. And I try to focus on those issues to deal with that. I want to know is how do you go about and address those intersectionality issues that I know are out there, but we don't have that conversation of why don't we talk about, Black issues the same way as Latino issues, because they are, from my perspective, I would say they're all the same. Because I would take them back to, the war on drugs and how, that pushed us all together from that particular perspective. But obviously it dates back farther.
Wow. And I know we don't have a lot of time, Justine. I'm looking at you and your two questions. We can spend hours and days and we need an adult beverage to decompress and process everything. But I'm going to tackle the first piece and then I'll open up to the panel for the second piece. Okay. Yes. In terms of Daca, and just to add some perspective, we're talking about 800,000 individuals. 800,000 of them. October the 5th was the deadline for folks to start renewing their permits, their work permits. And as of today, many of those brilliant young individuals, many of them are who consider themselves American, have already lost their status. So change is happening at the human level, not only for those Daca brilliant professionals and educators and also folks are working in our community, but also for their families. And I think that's the most important piece for all of us to learn, that when we're talking about immigration policy, even with an administrative piece to it, with President Obama's decision, we're also talking about the entire family. And I think that's something that we are missing in part of the conversation, that we are talking about families that are also part of a mixed status families where one person might be Daca, but his or her younger brother was born in the United States. And what does that do to the family and the community? What does it do to the educator that is teaching that student? What does it do to Apple, who has this brilliant employee and is thinking, 2019, 2020, this employee might not be with me, right? How can we galvanize corporate America to help us in that conversation right now, right? March 5th is also a huge deadline for our Daca brothers and sisters. And again, the clock is ticking. So from my perspective, we just have to bring the human side to the conversation. And do not forget that it's 800,000 of them, but also their families. People look and sound like me and also like you. And most of them are from Mexico, their families or themselves too. So the conversation needs to keep happening, but we need to be really intentional. And the work that Sonia has been doing on the ground is incredible to mobilize and educate and move the needle forward. And now to your second question, I will just turn it over to our panel and talk about intersectionality. And I have to say, I'm really cautious about using that word because as you can see, we're a dynamic group and I don't want to appropriate that term. But I want to see who wants to take that question. I don't know if Imani or Sonia, I can hear your brains kind of like thinking and moving to tackle the second question.
Well, thank you for that. I didn't catch the person's name of who asked the question, but it's such an incredible two-part question. So in the immigrant rights movement in the United States, right, we're trying to complicate this discourse around like who is like the best immigrant that we're all going to fight for. And I think that's the thing that we're trying to work against, meaning we're trying to complicate this kind of conversations and the narratives. We get conflated in supporting and uplifting only quote unquote good immigrants. And we're trying to move away from that. Daca has given us an opportunity for many young undocumented people to, you know, and actually Daca came about because it was the protest, the activism of young undocumented people to mobilize President Obama to you know, to initiate this Daca. But what I think what you were trying to say is like, how do we have these complicated conversations around immigration that does not leave out already marginalized communities? So Black Alliance for Just Immigration is one of the largest Black migrant-led organization in the country, in the United States, who's adamant in doing this work at the intersection of racial justice. And so even when we're thinking about detention centers, we have to see the correlation with that and the prison industrial that exists in the United States. How do we have conversations about, you know, the different that was happening with temporary protective status that is like really targeting many communities that are South and Central, and Haitian communities, Caribbean communities, African communities. We also can't leave out the Muslim ban, you know, that came earlier this year. And so I hear you on the conversation. It's a much broader, much intense, complicated conversation that is happening already in our communities. And we're trying to take lead from those folks who are in those embodied experience, many Black, many Muslim migrants who already been doing the work in this country on such issues.
Anyone else?
Yeah, if possible. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, Imani.
So just to add quickly, I mean, all of that is totally on point, and we also have to think about intersectionality around global economic policy and around an economic system that will extract from nations around the world, turning countries, turning entire regions into toxic, uninhabitable wastelands, and then leaving the people there to do what? To continue to work in these mines, in these oil refineries, and then try to bar them at the rhetorical door when they seek opportunity within those same countries, when they seek safe harbor within those same countries that have caused this massive imbalance to begin with. So I think that we all need to be a lot more well-versed on the international activities, on the foreign policies of our nations, of our respective nations, particularly speaking to my fellow Americans, and recognize that if we don't address our actions abroad, we are never going to be able to solve the problems that we have at home.
Yeah, thank you, Imani. Do we have another question? Do we have questions from the online forum? Yes.
Okay, I'll read the question from online. This question is from Dan Soriano. What resources are the Mexican government providing for the new arrivals, especially considering that many will have two processes of migration, U.S. to Mexico, Mexico?
Miguel and or Karina, were you able to hear the question in terms of resources for Mexican nationals going back to Mexico? In terms of resources available, provided for them upon return. Oh, we're muted too. Miguel or Karina, would you like to answer that question in terms of resources for Mexican nationals going back to Mexico?
Well, I didn't hear all the question. Resources for migrants going back. Didn't catch the question.
Mexican nationals going back to Mexico, returning back to Mexico. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is one of the challenges that Mexico is facing right now, because lots of migrants coming from Mexico to the comparison with those returning to Mexico are bigger. So we have a deficit in terms of receiving more migrants. Now, Mexico has been facing these challenges in terms of what we do. Mexico, probably because they want.
We can't hear you. Karina, would you like to answer specifically to that point and tie up in really briefly in terms of resources that you know that the Mexican government is providing, or the local community, civil society, upon return?
In terms of resources, I'm not quite sure, but I'm just going to build up from what I got that Miguel was trying to communicate here. It was the challenges that Mexico is facing, that for the first time we're having not only returning citizens to Mexico, but also as Mexico is functioning as a transition country, in some cases, it's also a destination, because the journey has become more dangerous. So people are starting to actually stay in the country, and we are facing this new dynamic, and Mexico is going to have to start dealing with this new panorama. So I think I'm not really sure about resources. Maybe Miguel. That, but that in terms of challenges, that's the new phase that we're going to have to be dealing with.
Yeah. Thank you, Karina. And I'm sorry, Miguel. Maybe we can continue the conversation offline. You all have most of our contact information, but it's right now 1 o'clock, and I'm getting the signal that is time for closing remarks. Any last comments before we close today's event?
Well, maybe one very brief one, which is what comes across to me, hearing 8 different perspectives on this, is that policy needs to operate at multiple levels. So there'll be city policy we've talked about in urbanization, and there's national policy. We've talked about whether it's Daca or other things, and then there's transnational policy, whether it's climate change and the environment, and multilateral approaches to that through, let's say, the United Nations. And I think the key to all of that is participation. As we want to influence each of those debates and make sure it's as inclusive as possible, so we address the issue of intersectionality and so on. It's about people being part of the debate. I think there's something very important for me in not leaving policy and politics to others. And I think that's the most important thing. And that's, I think, fantastic to see you as a group of young people taking this initiative and starting this debate in a small way, which will become a big way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the support. Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you all for your patience as we navigated time zones and sort of like the twilight zone, it feels like. So thank you. I really appreciate your time. And again, thank you to the British Council for providing this safe space for us to tackle a very difficult and nuanced topic. So thank you for your time. And have a great day.